Well, hey, ladies and gentlemen, didn't see you there. Welcome back to another episode. We're here today with professor of sociology at Boston College, Charles Derber. Charlie, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Chris. Good to see you. I wish I'm envious. I'd like to be a mayor in Germany with you, I'll tell you.
Well, we got a spot for you anytime you come out. We got a bedroom, clean the sheets, just give us 24 hours notice.
Fantastic. You might be surprised. My wife loves Europe, so I do too. Everybody in America wants to move to Europe right now, so
Absolutely. It's the time to escape. I mean, we're going through so much right now that I left in 2016. I knew that it was over. The jig was up. Trump was coming in. And personally, I just got to a point where I felt like it was ridiculous to live in a country with such a ludicrous, counterintuitive, anti-human philosophy.
And people are leaving, Chris. I mean, a lot of my friends, whether they're prominent academics or they're just ordinary people there's so much stress. My students, who are pretty privileged students at Boston College, they're all on mental health drugs. They're really stressed out because of the job situation here. The political atmosphere is really, really tough on everybody. The level of fear in the American population generally is very intense. And now that, I don't know if you saw that, just today the Supreme Court came out with a decision giving Trump complete power over all independent agencies, which include the media, for example, the Federal Communications Committee. He now can fire at will without any argument for regarding the head of the Federal Communications Commission. If he doesn't like, what kind of newspaper or magazine coverage he's giving them. I mean, so it just day after day, things get more and more scary.
Yeah, and I'm almost to the verge of not wanting to look, but then it's my job to look, and so it just becomes a nightmare. The passport, did you see the new passport that he's created?
Yes.
He stamped his picture on it and everything.
Yes.
We're going to look like, Turkmenistan in a matter of days now, and just...
it's very scary. And the book that we're going to be talking about, Wired for Authoritarianism, is... about all these things, but it takes a take on it, which I think might interest you and some of your audience, that while Trump is a really scary guy, and I think these are very, very dark times, the thrust of this book I've done, which is called Wired for Authoritarianism, as the book might suggest, is that Trump did not invent American authoritarianism. And the book makes this unorthodox argument that actually, while we have this sort of ideology of America being this exceptional democracy, sort of a model of democratic governance and history all through the country, there's something profoundly wrong. What I try to show in this book is that right from the very beginning, going back to the Constitution and the people who wrote the Constitution, there's always been a very deeply authoritarian strain in American politics. And Trump, most of our history, it took the form of what I call covert authoritarianism. In other words, the people running the country often didn't sit in the White House, or the people who had a lot of power, who typically were people like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and other very, very wealthy people. They had figured out a way of running the country as robber barons, or the corporate power that be, in a very clever manner, which was to remain outside of government, to allow elections, and to allow people who are in government to appear to be responding to the will of the people. But what I show in this book is that really going back all the way to the Constitution, the country was never really structured on a democratic model. The people who wrote the Constitution, that James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, was a huge slave owner and a very wealthy guy from Virginia, from the South. George Washington himself was one of the largest slaveholders in America. And even Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and sort of these guys were very eloquent, intellectually developed, smart people. But what they show is that you can be very erudite and intellectually sophisticated and still very much of a sort of develop a kind of politics that's self-interested and that is not really a politics intended to really empower ordinary people. They just really had, just to give you a little bit of at the beginning of this book, Wired for Authoritarianism, I decided I'd talk a little about the Constitution, because I think everybody goes back to the Constitution and says, well, that's the period when America really did express democratic ideas and ideals. And, there's truth to the fact that there's some very eloquent democratic language in the Constitution. But Chris, the reality is that these guys, and I dug deep into this history, when these guys were like Jefferson and Madison were writing the Constitution, they were very influenced by country a little close to you, England, and they were looking at the Magna Carta, which was the document that was written by the British, who were trying to sort of limit the power of the king. And the No Kings protests here that are against Trump go all the way back to the idea that, well, America was founded in this very democratic revolution against the idea of a king. And it's true that the guys who wrote the Constitution were very much against the idea of a king ruling everything. However, when you look at what the actual name of the Constitution that they gave it was called the Article of the Barons. Now that goes back to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a document written by the nobility in the British Middle Ages, where the barons and other very wealthy aristocracy were revolting against the king, who was sort of taxing them to go on various wars in France and Germany and elsewhere. And so they wanted to basically limit the power of the king, but they never had, this is now the British writing the Magna Carta. And remember, when Jefferson and Madison were writing the American Constitution, the model they had in mind was the Magna Carta. Actually, when you see pictures of Jefferson and the founders writing, they have pictures of the Magna Carta, and it was like their ideal. And it was true that they were saying, we don't want King George III, who was a pretty constitutional monarch at that point. He didn't have a huge amount of power in Britain, but he was a king. He had some power. But when they were challenging the power of the king, as with the Magna Carta, they were not thinking about spreading the power of the king to ordinary people, not in the least, not in the slightest bit. They were like, as in the Magna Carta itself, their idea was, let's spread the power of the king to the entire nobility. The king is claiming too much of the class of the aristocracy that was the sort of royal family and royal class that was running Europe at the time. And so when the American Constitution was written, what people seized on was the idea that they were curbing the power of the king, which is true. They didn't want a king, but they didn't have any idea of spreading power to ordinary people. What they wanted to spread it to the barons. We got the robber barons in the United States. You know this phrase, Chris, of robber barons, which are the first robber barons came at the end of the Civil War as they built the railroads, Vanderbilt, they built the oil companies, Rockefeller, Morgan built the American financial system, Carnegie built the steel plants. These guys were called robber barons because they became the first billionaires in America in the 1890s. And most American workers were poor, they were immigrants. The journalists at the time were writing books like The Jungle, which were about how ordinary workers were basically, serfs like in the Middle Ages, living in poverty. And this was supposed to be the great democracy of the world. These people couldn't vote. Do you know what percentage, Chris, of people could vote at the time the Constitution was written, when George Washington came in? What percentage of Americans were viewed as worthy of voting
Oh, that's a good one. I'll say 20%.
Whoa, you're really you've been bought in a little bit too much to that. We were talking about smart teeth. That's a little bit off. It's about 2% or less. I mean, and to be specific,
Wow.
you didn't even vote for the president. Typically, the only people, first off, of course, as you know, slaves were counted as 3/5 of people. They were not. Black people were not, whether free or slaves, had no citizenship at all. So that was a lot of people, and that they had no vote at all. Of course, women could not legally own property or vote. So those were also, that's 50% of the population.
50% right off, yeah.
Right off. And then if you count in then black people, of course, Native Americans, and then think about white men. Well, what percentage, Chris, of white men were thought of worthy of voting at the time of the Constitution when they actually had?
You'd have to assume that throughout history, the 1% have basically maintained power throughout century to century. And so poor white men would not be able to vote. So out of all the white men, you're probably looking at, 2 to 5% again.
Yeah, you're right. You had to be substantially own property, and most white men did not own a lot of property during this period. Mm-hmm. So right from the beginning, the Constitution, and this is where that Magna Carta idea becomes real, that they had an image of a country that would not be ruled by a king, but would be ruled by this class of very wealthy people who originally were in Europe were the aristocrats, the nobility, and in America became the kind of, I don't know if you remember when you're in the United States, but if you go to Newport, Rhode Island, there's a bunch of palaces that were built by the robber barons, and they're very famous. Everybody goes to visit them these days. This is in Rhode Island. And what they're doing is they're the houses of Rockefeller and Carnegie and all these really rich industrialists who were modeling themselves. They built these palaces. Did you ever go to them when you were in the United States?
No, and in fact, I've never heard of them. I only was aware of the Hearst Mansion.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, they're famous, and everybody goes to see them. And they're palaces that were built by the robber barons because they were trying to live palatially, sort of royally, like the sort of nobility that they were talking about in the Constitution. So what happened was that after the Civil War, obviously America was run as a racial hierarchy, which had some fascist overtones to it because, fascism in Europe really developed. We were talking about this before we went on air, and Hitler certainly understood what he was doing as a way of purging all races that were not the Aryan race in Europe, and that included Jews and Slavs and Roma, of course, most of all Jews. And he was we were talking, off before air, that he regarded the United States as a model of the kind of fascism that he wanted to build. This is not a tangential thing; it's a really big part of the history of German fascism and the way Nazism developed. So it's just a sign that the Confederacy in America, which was an explicitly racially slave-based society, had a very, I call it American fascism. It had a very race-based kind of authoritarian system. And after the Civil War and the North triumphed, you looked at like we might be moving in a more democratic way. The slaves were freed and Reconstruction happened. But, Reconstruction, which was an effort to build a more robust, electorate where more people could vote and so forth, it didn't happen. Within 10 years, Reconstruction was abandoned. And you had these, these robber barons, these industrial billionaires coming into power. And again, like Trump, using the Supreme Court as a way to essentially build their own kind of authoritarian system in America. And I'll give you one example of that. You probably have never heard of it. Most Americans don't know of it, but I write about this quite a bit in this book, Wired for Authoritarianism, because it shows how the law combined with big money to really make it hard to have any kind of real voice for the people. In 1876, there was a railroad case in the Supreme Court called the Santa Clara case. The reason it's important is that this was a Supreme Court that was extremely, much like today, it was very, very conservative. And it was interested in building as an executive, just like, I don't know if you saw this in Germany today, but there were 3 or 4 major decisions by the Supreme Court today, which concentrated more and more power into Trump and into saying that he has all the power over the executive branch. You can fire any agent, independent agency leader, whatever. And so what happened is the Santa Clara Act, is an act, a decision by the Supreme Court, which said this, Chris. It said that corporations have constitutional personhood. Corporations have the rights and actually are people who are, and that if that this evolved into the constitutional doctrine that giving money is a form of speech. So if you curb or limit the right of corporations to pour billions of dollars into politics, to lobby or to elect candidates or to give the dark money, as you know today, literally billions of dollars go into every election cycle. If you try to limit that money, you're violating the Constitution, the most fundamental right of the Constitution, which is free speech, because giving money is now equated in the Constitution with free speech. So if you limit the ability of a billionaire, like a trillionaire, like Mr. Musk, to give $2 billion to the Republicans, as he's likely to do, you can be brought into court of violating the First Amendment, because if you try to limit the flow of money into politics, you are now violating the Constitution. So that was a decision that was made by a robber baron court. And what it did is it turned the government, it allowed essentially to say, well, these wealthy corporate elites who are running so much of the country, they don't have to be in government. They can be outside, and they can deliver a tremendous amount of leverage through their money and through their networks of policy organizations. Now, today, for example, we have the Heritage Foundation, which wrote Project 2025, which is what Trump is governing on right now, right? That's how the robber barons have ruled for the last 150 years. Before Trump, they didn't have to go into government. They created all these foundations. They had tons of money. The courts said this money is legal tender it's essentially a substitute for voting. If you have a lot of money, you can, swamp the vote and fundamentally get the people in office that you want. And that's the way America has basically been run over the last, what I do in the book is I know it sounds just sort of like I'm ranting on here, but in the book, it's a careful documentation of exactly how these decisions were made and how these corporate elites, these very wealthy people, were able to build a network of organizations and funding, and that affected the courts and affected lobbyists and affected almost all the laws, and built this kind of shadow government behind the official government. That's why I call it a system of covert authoritarianism. It was covert because it looked very democratic. People were voting. Women finally, 1920, women finally got the right to vote. White male expansion of vote and so forth. We're still a very low voting country. You probably know there are about 350 million people in America. Over 100 million qualified people in America do not vote. We have the lowest voting rate. So even though we've expanded the franchise, and the reason, if you say, well, why are so few Americans voting? We're the lowest voting country in the world, in the developed world. The answer is Americans understand kind of intuitively that both parties are all wrapped up in the arms of these very wealthy donors, and that both the Republican and the Democratic Party run with huge amounts of money, and but with policies and scripts written by corporate consultants who basically lay out what the pharmaceutical bill, what the agricultural bill, what the energy policy. I mean, it's just all being written. What I try to show is that in the name of democracy, And it's very clever because we look very democratic. There are elections, there are important bills of rights in the Constitution. It looks, but what it's managed to do, and this is what I try to show in the book, is to disguise, create a sort of put a veil over the incredible amount of power that these corporate elites, who are very, very closely tied to the military as well, because they're all entangled, the military-industrial complex. And as the new robber barons, the ones in Silicon Valley who are now the richest people in the world and are running, all the big, AI and social media and AI companies, big tech, they're the second generation of robber barons. And they are, when Trump came in, you probably saw pictures, but on the inauguration platform, Trump was surrounded by the heads of the seven, what are called the Magnificent Seven, which are the seven big companies in Silicon Valley, which is Meta and Google and, Musk's company and Bezos, Amazon, Apple. These guys now, they literally, Musk himself, as you know, when he did the IPO for bringing public his space company. By the way, Musk is interesting. He's very open about this stuff. He says, look, we're destroying the world because we can make a lot of profit. But he says, we're going to create planets where other people like ourselves are going to be able to go. So they're talking about colonizing space.
Sure.
And, the two richest people in the world, Bezos and Musk, are both deeply into space companies, because they know that they can ultimately make more money, on other planets than they're planning to do here. But just to go back for a minute to the thread of how this authoritarianism developed. So you had this covert authoritarianism, this kind of disguised authoritarianism. What's different about Trump is that he ripped off the disguise. He made it a more overtly transparent system. He basically said, I'm going to bring the billionaires into government. They had been ruling sort of from the outside for most of American history. What Trump did was he said, look, he's a billionaire himself. So he comes into the office and there are 13 billionaires in the White House right now. And that, the first thing he did was brought Musk, the world's richest person, and made him, quote, co-president. And he brought it, in the big economic area, the Treasury is run by a guy from Wall Street named Scott Bessent, who's a billionaire. Secretary of Commerce is a guy named Howard Lutnick, an Epstein guy who is also a billionaire. So what's happened is that, and this is what's gotten people so upset about Trump, is that Trump has basically, he didn't invent the authoritarianism. He basically ripped off the disguise. So he's a guy that, he thinks he can sell anything, and he can sell himself as king and monarch. And so he just ripped off all the prior stuff. So we're in this new, very dark period where Trump feels empowered to openly say that he runs the country. He runs it with these very, very rich people, and he runs it. The amount of money, he's made $6 billion himself as White House just in the last year, and he's making money hand over fist for these guys that are giving him all this money. So essentially, Trump is the latest phase of a very long history of kind of betrayal of these democratic ideas, this creed of America, that we are this exceptional democracy. This isn't to say that there aren't great ideals that are built into some of the language of the Declaration of Independence and some of the language of the Constitution, the amendments. But the actual practice, when you get down on the ground, is really a very different story. And the only reason I'm really talking about this is that we've got elections coming up, and the question, the problem is that people don't vote very often because they understand that the two parties are both, like Ralph Nader has often said, a corporate duopoly. We have two corporate parties. I used to call them Bush and Bush Light, right? You have two parties. Yeah. You could get Bush or you could get Bush Light, depending on which you prefer, but you're getting the same thing basically. And so in this book, I also offer my ways of thinking about how to move beyond this long history that we've been entrapped by, which is to tell the truth about it, to recognize, we can be grateful to Trump that he stripped away a lot of the disguises that have kept this system going, because people now understand all over the world, and you're in Germany and Europe, you guys know how bad it's gotten in America. And that's terrible. And I don't want to romanticize that way, but it is beginning to wake people up. We've had these huge protests on the streets. And they're the largest in American history. We've had over 12 million people protesting. And you know, they're not just in Boston or New York or, you know, the eastern, you know, or liberal parts of the country. They're all over the country. And so I see a very new kind of, you know, and this has to do with where the Democratic Party might be going. The question is, will we always have Bush and Bush Light? Or will we, or the Trump version of Bush, or will we get something different? And so a large part of the book looks at the Democratic Party and where it's going, and whether in fact you're beginning to see the emergence of some recognition. You see it with AOC and Bernie Sanders and some of the more left populist, progressive populist kinds of people in the Democratic Party. And I do think you're seeing some real change in parts of the Democratic Party. And so a lot of this book is looking at current political and social developments. And, you know, and the reason I think there's some hope is you can't have any political democracy without economic democracy. I mean, the reason we've had authoritarianism, we have this top-down economic system, and the people with all the money and economic control control the political system. So the question then becomes, can you have a more democratically based economy? And what's happened is, you're in Germany now, so you've been there for a while, but the economy really, really, really sucks for almost all Americans today. You know, polls are showing that about, 70% of Americans say we hate the way America is being run by these big companies. They understand now that these billionaires, it's just so obvious, you can't miss it. They have so much money, and so much of it is being thrown into politics, and all of their agenda is out front. And, you know, it's just, you don't have to be an academic you don't have to be a student. You can see it. It's obvious. Ordinary people say, I understand that they are getting rich at our expense, and we're having trouble paying our rent or paying our mortgage or paying for groceries or paying for gasoline at the pump. And that's important, because people are waking up. I mean, a very, very a super majority of Americans, and this includes independents and Republicans, not just Democrats, are saying the country is being run by this oligarchy, or, you know, sort of elite, authoritarian elite of very wealthy people aligned with Trump right now. And we can't make it. We're not going to get through the month. You know, for the last number of years, about 60% of Americans say they're living paycheck to paycheck. People really are struggling here, Chris. They're really, really having trouble paying their bills. And that's putting pressure on the Bush-like political system. And people are people from all over the country are saying, I can't survive this. You know, kids can't go to school. I mean, people can't, and meanwhile, Trump is so openly grifting and corrupting and, you know, taking paybacks from companies. I mean, the grift and corruption level is just so obvious that I think this set of issues that historically has been disguised has come into the open. And more Americans, I found my own classes when I asked them, what is the biggest problem in the country today? A couple of years ago, they would not have said this. Today, they all say right away, it's the economic division between the rich and the poor in the United States. Is just overwhelming. And these are people who are coming from well-to-do families. And Boston College is a pretty affluent college, university. So I see emerging in the country right now where things have become so extreme, where the divisions between this very wealthy oligarchy, because they're so rich, they're the richest people in human history, and they're not shy at all about telling us that and openly buying the government, you know, basically buying everything about, there are more lobbyists in Washington by a factor of 10 than there are legislators, and they are writing the laws, and they are buying the the politicians, and people are suffering. They're not making. You don't have. I mean, this is not a political statement. It's just a statement of the reality of ordinary people, which is they're not getting by. And I should say that's tied to another issue, which I've written about in another book, which I also talk a lot about because it relates to how Trump got. It's the fact that people are really losing a sense of connection to each other. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but the sense, I call this socioside. It's like suicide, except it's the society essentially destroying itself because the connections between people. I don't know if you know this. What would you guess, Chris, if I asked you how many people in America eat all their meals, adults, eat all their meals by themselves?
How many
What
adults,
percent of Americans eat all their meals alone? They don't have people to eat dinner or lunch with.
To have a proper dinner. Yeah, most of them are hunched over the steering wheel of their car, choking down a burrito while they're on their way to their third job.
Yes,
so you're right. Probably 80%.
80% are eating meals alone. Yeah. I mean, I think the numbers, they're very varied. But they're around 60%. And the reason I mention this is that eating with people has always been a measure, I think, of people feeling connected to other people. When you have a meal with somebody, it's always been a kind of sort of emotional way of people feeling that they belong to something. They're eating with people. The fact, now, if you go across the board, how many friends do people report they have? How many close friends? Are they getting married? Are they having kids? All those numbers are in deep decline. I've written about this in this book and another book. So people are scared because they're losing, as you say, they're working a lot of part-time jobs, temp jobs, gig jobs, contractor jobs. They don't have the same relations with people at work if they have a job. And the family is also, and neighborhood is all breaking down. The relevance of this to Trump and authoritarianism, Hannah Arendt, the famous philosopher who wrote about Germany and fascism, said, the fundamentals of fascism go back to isolation, people feeling alone and scared and not feeling safe and secure and connected. So what we're seeing in this larger picture that I've been describing is this breakdown of community. If you look at the people who voted for Trump, they have very, very low connections to other people. I mean, most of these people say they got interested in going to Trump rallies because it was the one place they could meet other people. And they go around the country together and they become friends. And they're the only friends they know. And, it works kind of like a cult. People join cults when they're feeling alone. And there's somebody on top, an authoritarian sort of guy who says, I will save you. Just follow me. And, you'll be a member of this app. I'll take good care of you. And I'll take good care of the country. But you just have to do what I say. And you're willing to sacrifice yourself for him.
And so I remember him from the 1980s, from commercials and stuff. And and there's a nostalgia there. Fascism needs to thrive too. Yeah.
Right. That's right. So these issues all come together. And I think the hopeful thing is that I'm seeing people, the fact that so many people have gone out to protest and Trump is being so outrageous and things are so difficult for so many. People are so scared and they're scared economically, they're scared socially, that I think we might be reaching a tipping point where the Democratic Party might begin to break a little bit from this Bush light kind of model and try to say, hey, we really need to do something different in this country. We've got to deal with the concentration of wealth and power in a tiny number of people. It's never been like this. About 10 families. You were mentioning the robber barons, and of course, what I find the difference is back then the factories or the ways that these people were making their money in the Gilded Age was through domestic factories, but now everything has been outsourced, and so the middle class and the poor aren't even getting the scraps, and they're all mostly going to wherever they can get these low wages and stuff. That's right. And so I would just wonder how it's going to play out
knowing that the global south is going to take back a lot of their factories. And China, we made China the factory of the world in the 1990s and imported goods, and now they run the show and they have the material conditions to absolutely obliterate us. And the only thing that really kept America safe was that its outsourced slave labor, slave wages, and imported goods were predicated on the military-industrial complex. Like, you're going to make T-shirts at gunpoint, you're going to like it. Right. And this is where we have been. And now it's all coming to the surface. People are learning the word imperialism, and we're starting to see that Trump is saying the quiet part out loud. What do you think will be the end result? Will there be a civil war? They're not going to relinquish power willfully. They don't just hand over the keys to the kingdom.
What you said is very important, Chris. I'm really glad you mentioned it, which is that, America is an empire, and we have a military-industrial complex now amplified by, scary stuff around surveillance and, AI and, the war in Iran. They're saying is the first autonomous war because so many of the targeting was done by AI and sort of like not by people. And as you say, those wars are being fought. They've been fought for years, for decades, in order to build up the profits of American companies. And that's why America goes to war, is to make sure that it has the global resources, the global cheap labor, the global resources that it needs to, it doesn't have to worry. Now, Trump was elected by those workers who felt exactly like you described. They felt that they were being screwed by these people who were sending their jobs abroad, and now everything was being outsourced. Trump said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to bring back jobs and manufacturing from Asia and, Latin America. And he didn't. He said he went and did more wars in the Middle East and Latin America. And people are waking up, and even a lot of Trump supporters are saying, what the hell? This guy promised us he was going to bring the jobs back, and he wasn't going to spend these billions of dollars on war. And he went and did this crazy, murderous stuff that he's doing in Iran, and he's supporting in Israel and so forth. And people are understanding a lot of his own base. You've probably seen that people like Tucker Carlson, probably the sort of the media people on the far right, are breaking with Trump around the fact that he promised no war, and now he's becoming your classical militarist. He was always in that same tradition. But I think that, as you say, people are waking up to this. They're saying, no, we're enough of this war. It's not doing any good for America. It's not doing any good, certainly for those countries. And we need this money back invested in our economies here in the United States, because the urban infrastructure, you try to drive around, in Massachusetts, 70% of the bridges are, falling. They're substandard. You can't drive on them. So we need massive investment in infrastructure, in healthcare. Most people in America can't. At least you're living in a country where people have access to healthcare and higher education. They don't have that stuff here. Americans look, my students, when they look at European students coming over to study, in quite a few of my classes, they can't believe how lucky German students and French and Danish, and that you have some measure of safety nets and social democracy, which just doesn't exist in the United States. So I think the fact that people are now saying, what the hell is going on with these wars? Why are we sending more money off there and going into these, because Trump promised them that he was going to make the economy work for them again. Of course, he did exactly the opposite. He's redistributed more money from his base of white working class people in Pennsylvania and Michigan to the very wealthiest people in Silicon Valley. He's done that. So he's really betrayed them. And that's why his numbers are so bad. And that's why he's, rigging all these election laws to make sure that people are not going to be able to vote. There's a very good chance that elections are going to be suspended on grounds of an emergency. One of the things I show in here is how Trump is using constitutional means. So, for example, the declaration of emergency is something written into the Constitution. It gives the president the ability to suspend, Trump has, invented and declared in the first year of his second term, 21 emergencies: national security, economic emergencies for the terrorists, national security for Venezuela. And what it does is it basically says, I don't have to listen to Congress. I don't have to listen because it's an emergency. In an emergency, this is, by the way, Article 48 of the Weimar German Constitution is what Hitler declared to take over. Hitler became chancellor in Germany in 1933 in January. He had basically become a total dictator by March of 1933. And he did it, he also, like Trump, he came in through the electoral process, and then he used the Weimar Constitution in Germany was a constitution that allowed, it's called Article 48, which is an article in the Weimar German, that was the 20s German Constitution, which basically said that the chancellor can basically declare a national emergency, suspend suspend the legislature. There would be no more Reichstag. There would be no more courts independent of it. And Hitler used all that and immediately shut down all the other forms of government, the legislature and the courts, which is exactly what Trump is doing today in America. And he's also using emergency measures that are constitutionally legitimate. I mean, he's inventing these emergencies, but he has the right that's built into this Constitution to declare emergency. A lot of this book that I've written, Wired for Authoritarianism, is how our Constitution and law is wired to allow leaders, not only to corporations to bring all this money into power, but to allow leaders to declare emergencies that shut down the courts and shut down the legislature and to rule as dictators, basically. And there is a lot, I think your German audience might be interested, that I do a lot of comparison of the rise of Hitler in Germany in the 30s and its parallels with how Trump has come to power and how intertwined these two kinds of politics have been. You and I were talking a little about that before. And I'm doing a book on this. We might have another conversation about that, which will come out, which is exactly about the relation between American fascism and German fascism. But they're really tightly intertwined in many ways. And but Germany found some way to recover after World War II, after Hitler, and America will find a way to recover, but it can't go back. The whole message of my argument is a lot of the people in the resistance just say, get rid of Trump and we'll be back to where we want to be. No, we'll be back in the second Gilded Age. We'll be back in this covert kind of authoritarianism. So a lot of my book is about how to move beyond just thinking about getting rid of Trump. That's really important. It's really important to get rid of Trump. But the idea of just going back to Bush or even just to Obama, there's something, you've got to get to the second Gilded Age robber barons. You've got to get to the Santa Clara Act. You've got to get to the emergency declarations in the Constitution. You need what the Germans have ultimately done is create more of a social democratic kind of economy that gives working people a better chance, not a great chance, but a better chance of doing more. And I'd actually lean a lot on Europe and European history, because Europe has a history of some of this authoritarianism, but it also has a history of how social democratic politics can begin to build you out, lead you toward an economic model that takes you behind this kind of covert authoritarianism. As long as you have a radically hierarchical capitalist system, Marx was right about this one thing for sure, that in a capitalist system, very wealthy people are going to have a lot of clout. They're going to run much of the country. And that started with the Santa Clara Act and with the Gilded Age system and this covert authoritarianism. So we got to get rid of Trump, but we also have to get the overt authoritarianism. We have to get rid of the covert authoritarianism that's run the country since the first Gilded Age. And I think the last chapter of my book actually looks at how America can do that and what we can learn from Europe, what Europe has done and what it hasn't been able to do to sort of make progress in this area.
Yeah. I don't know if we'll have it in time, but, the people have historical amnesia, of course, that we had Hitler came in, and now most of the people who might have experienced the horrors of World War II are long gone. And we're ready to try the wrong thing yet again to see if it'll work, patch the holes in capitalism once it fails. And, honestly, I have to say China is winning, and their model, or whatever byproducts come from it, is a better model. It makes more sense. It's economically sustainable. It's also more moral in the sense that it doesn't leave all these people to die. Even Mao, for all of his faults, said that healthcare is a human right, housing is and Xi Jinping says housing is for living in, not for speculation. This is a radically crazy idea that most Americans would probably agree with until you tell them who said it,
it is true. And this is, people don't understand that the overwhelming majority of Americans believe what you just said, Chris. I mean, they overwhelmingly believe that healthcare is a right, that everybody is, there's something so fundamentally human about the idea that people should be allowed to have access to healthcare. The same is true of education. People believe what you're saying is true in China. I mean, I don't like the authoritarian system of China. I have a lot of Chinese graduate students and so forth. I do not like the authoritarian kind of governance. You can't say what you want in it. I have Chinese professor friends who can't say what they believe in the classroom. I'm really believe in democracy. But you're right that China has built a kind of idea of economic rights that are very, very important for Western countries to adopt. And I think the Europeans, even though they're having a lot of trouble right now, and I understand, Germany has been dealing with central banks that are going back to neoliberal capitalist kinds of things, which are really, really, that's the part of the legacy of the inflation of Germany in the 20s and so forth. But yeah, there are a lot of problems that the Germans and the Europeans have to deal with. But if you were to come back, Chris, and spend a little bit more time in the United States, you would look fondly on Germany, because Germany is doing, in terms of basic economic and social needs of ordinary people, it's doing a hell of a lot better than Americans. Americans just are not cutting it. Like I say, the vast majority of Americans say a lot of them are not able to eat. We have about 1 out of every 5 kids in America are starving or hungry.
We have an amazing welfare system in Germany to where people who are homeless can get a home, and not only that they'll give them money for furniture, and that they'll get them all set up and then point them in the right direction to jobs and take it very easy on them. The other thing is university education is free. It's absolutely free. There are a few fees on top of it, but for the most part, that they offer it for free. And in addition, of course, the healthcare, we have healthcare and decent dental care. But I will say this, we are moving your direction. We are just a little bit better, but we're still going downhill in a big hurry.
That's terrible.
We're overspending on military right now.
Right. Yeah, the military stuff is really scary. I agree. But what you said, Chris, I wish all my students had just heard it, because you just described a system of basic healthcare, education, social welfare that are so, when you don't have it at all, and believe me, America does not have that stuff. Trump is ripping whatever we had from the New Deal has been abandoned. The Democrats abandoned it. Trump is stripping away the rest of it. So if people and my students heard what you had just said, I wish I had a little tape of that, they would all want to move to Germany immediately. Because they really, really can't understand how they live in a country which is denying ordinary people who are working hard, trying to work as hard as they can, the very basic essentials of life that you need to be a human being. So I do talk a lot about Europe. I agree with you. Europe is in trouble right now, but it still has a model of history since World War II that is worth looking at, and there's things to preserve in that model. And
the other thing is, you talked about, you have another book, you're coming and you touch more on the social aspect of things, the social cohesion, and the social contract, which is now fracturing the idea that people need to be able to trust people blindly. We need to have a system where there's credentials and credibility, and then faith is placed in these institutions or people to do a job. And that's all fracturing. Nobody believes experts. And what do you think will happen with this? And I think distinctly when you rip away these important things like healthcare and stuff, then we mutate into people who are less than human, where we've actually conditioned ourselves to walk over homeless people to get to work and say, I've been told that that gentleman didn't work hard enough, and that's the end of that story. And I need,
Right.
I just wonder, how do you see the social contract going in the next decade to, 50 years down the road? I mean, we'll all be dead by then, probably anyway. But where do you see the social contract lying? Because the psychology and the mental illness of America is one of the things that is most interesting to me about politics. I always say, if you want to know politics, you should first study zoology. Then you'll get a really good idea about what you're in for.
Well, I think you're hitting the nail on your head. And, I got interested in, there's a guy named C. Wright Mills, it was a 20th century sociologist, who said, what we really ought to understand is that public personal troubles are always integrally related. They're sort of part and parcel of public issues. You're connecting politics with psychology, and that's all of my work is like that. Well, I write about these large economic power and financial things. It's all based on looking at the way the underlying sort of social fabric, the way in which people are relating to each other at the workplace, in the neighborhood. These are very, very closely intertwined. So I think and also what you just said, Chris, was also, I thought, quite compelling about how people losing trust in basic institutions. They don't trust anything. People have no trust, and they have reason not to trust. There's scams going on. Everybody's getting scammed either online or through commercial things and so forth. So this is not some abstract political challenge. Authoritarianism might sound like a very academic or abstract thing. It's really a system about who you can trust to build a kind of common future with, and are there people you can trust? And how does that trust get represented in kind of ways of, people, it's easy to lose people when you go from the personal relationship to the actual economic or political institutions. But people understand that they need workplaces where they're being treated like human beings and they can survive, and that's being ripped apart and they don't have it. And they need, God, it's been too long since you've been in America, but if you go into a hospital these days or into a medical, it feels like things are falling apart. The doctors and the nurses are under great stress, and the systems are simply not being funded. There is this, in some way, I think you really put your finger on it. I don't know, you kept up very well from Europe, but there's a kind of collapse in the underlying fabric of social trust and social connection. It's really important. And my hope is that as we try to rebuild politically and economically, it will be, that's the way successful political movements, like in the New Deal period of the Depression, I don't know if there's a book called The Romance of American Communism that's quite famous. It's about how ordinary sort of workers built families and communities and cultures and summer camps and poetry and music around their working class struggles to try to keep a job. Most Americans were having trouble keeping a job or getting a job. And she writes about, this is a book by Vivian Gornick, which is about how the effort to create a viable life and through these, efforts to take over factories and to create basic, healthcare and education and job guarantees, how that flowered and depended on the rise of a kind of community and new trust. You've said it so well. When you break down these basic fabrics of people trusting each other, we have, I've written a lot about gun violence, the level of distrust that people have on the streets with each other. But it's just a really, really big part of the problem. And it's not separate from politics, even though politics always seems more abstract and more theoretical. But it's really rooted in these face-to-face personal, emotional. You're so right. Politics is really in the realm of the emotion. One of the things I liked about the women's movement is that it said, politics starts in the bedroom. And what the key thing there was the idea that politics is not some abstract thing. It's about the most intimate relationships. It happens, and like race relations happen. A black man like Emmett Till in the 50s could look a white woman in the face for a few seconds, and he would be hauled off, and Emmett Till was lynched, as you know, simply for looking at a white woman, and she claimed that he was somehow ogling her or harassing her. But all these political things get expressed in these very human, emotional, interactional forms. And what I try to do in my work is connect these political things with the very emotive. I think you're absolutely right. When you're dealing with authoritarian politics, you're dealing with a level of social breakdown, a breakdown in the fabric of trust, and the people feeling any sense of decency or connection to each other, people feeling scared. Fascism and authoritarianism is all about fear. And I write a lot about fear and how people deal with fear. I say you really should look at your own fear carefully.
The psychologists will tell you, they say when your amygdala is activated and you have your fight or flight response activated, you are incapable of thinking logically. And this is, and perceived dangers and scarcity are the two things that can push us into a mode where all of a sudden we're happily killing children because we're scared.
Right. And that goes back to Hannah Arendt's idea that when people are alone or don't feel protected, they don't have a sense of security. That leads to this fascism, because fascist leaders, authoritarian, very fascist leaders say, I will take care of you. Just turn yourself over to me. And that was the Trump base. They just said, I don't care what he does, I just trust him as my leader, and I'll die for him, which is pretty much what people said for Hitler, who believed in Hitler. It's very understandable when the amygdala, as you say, is sort of your brain is sending out messages every minute saying, you're running with anxiety and with stomach churning. And when that's happening in your body, it's not, people are that's going to be their primal. I always talk to my students about the world can be blowing up from climate change, but if you have a mild stomach ache, you're going to be focused on your stomach, because there's something about what you're feeling in your own body and in your own mind about how, your own brain and what kind of signals you're getting in your body. You're going to respond not to what you're reading about in some abstract politics. You're going to respond to what's feeling in the stomach or in the brain. And that's how authoritarian movements grow. They play to these visceral fears and anxieties and divisions, and they build them. Trump is a master of building hate and social division of all kinds, because people are angry. They have really good reason to be angry, because they're working hard and they're getting screwed. And Trump says, I'll solve it for you. It's these immigrants here. It's these Haitians who are eating your cats and dogs, in Springfield, Ohio. And I'm going to get rid of them, but you got to help me, and so
they're going to keep doing that. And he's not the only. The Heritage Foundation really are the wheels behind. He's just sort of the pilot of the automobile. The automobile itself is made out of think tank money and
that's what I was saying. The whole covert authoritarian system in the United States is exactly that. The people in the White House are they're not driving the automobile. It's just on autopilot from the from Elon Musk's self-driving car that was programmed by the Heritage Foundation, But that's the way it's been. I mean, the Council on Foreign Relations, I don't know, but that was the system that Henry Kissinger, the Dulles brothers under Eisenhower, all the people who ran American empire and wars during the mid-20th century, those guys were all part of the Heritage Foundation at the time, was called the Council on Foreign Relations. It still exists. It was the breeding ground for all of America's wars and all of America's strategies for dominating the world globally, so they could outsource jobs and take over those resources, whether it was oil and that was the system that the robber barons built up. That's what I try to outline in this book, Wired for Authoritarianism. It's a very real system. It had country clubs, it had think tanks, it had all kinds of schools where these people get to know each other, and where they plan. I don't mean this is not a huge conspiracy theory. It's just a description of the way a class of people operated and what its effects were on people around the world. It meant devastation and destruction in wars, and people at home just being deprived of the basic essentials to be human. So the whole issue of being human in the United States is a very big. You put your finger on it. I love the way you said it. You should go back and listen to it, where you talked about how when people just don't have some basic sense that they can trust anybody, they really feel that there's nobody around that is trustworthy, and they can
you collapse. You collapse mentally,
and that leads to a kind of social collapse. That's where, like, I read it, which I've tried to show in this book, leads you toward this kind of authoritarian politics where you're so scared and things around you are collapsing. And so what you feel is, I need a strong leader or somebody who really will put some order in this thing and protect me. He says he's going to do everything I need to protect as long as I do as he says. It's a very primitive, visceral kind of reaction, and authoritarians have played on it for a very, very long time. Yeah. It's just now the amount of stress that on the amygdala, on the feelings of most Americans is so intense. It's hard to communicate if you're not here, but. Life expectancy is going way down in America.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't need really good eyes to see what's going on over there. I just get on the news and I try to look around and see what the news is from back home. But you have 60% of the population can't read above a 6th grade level. You have the life expectancy now, which is lower than Cuba's and North Korea's. You have 60% of people believe in angels. 70% believe that their own country is in rapid decline. But, the education is the one way out of authoritarianism. And it's one of the reasons, the correlations, they say, people who come out of school are generally more left-wing and the people who don't aren't. And it's because education is the one, it's like garlic to the vampire that is authoritarian capitalism. And if people would learn, but the thing is, that's why Trump came out and said, I love the poorly educated. And I'm sure he does, because they're the ones who are angry, but not really quite smart enough to understand how things work.
Yeah, so he's ripping them off like mad, and he's betraying them unbelievably.
Sure.
I mean, I like the fact that, I don't know how much of this has been communicated to Europe, but and this is, I think, a positive thing, in this sort of kind of internal rethinking and refeeling things in the Democratic Party and to the left of the Democratic Party. There's a real effort to get people who have not been privileged to go to school. As you say, about 60% of Americans have never been to school. And that is by higher education of any kind. And Europe has at least a very good job. Germany has a really great vocational ed program and that kind of thing. America doesn't have that stuff. Yeah. And so I think that you're beginning to see, I don't know if you've seen, there's organizations called Run for Something. And they're telling working class people who never would run for an office to run for office. I mean, to get a much wider distribution of people into public life, and you're beginning to see, and people like AOC are very strong on this, but even people like Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, these are not well-known Democrats, but Chris Van Hollen, who's the Democratic senator from Maryland, Jeff Merkley from Oregon, Chris Murphy from Connecticut. There are these kind of mainstream Democrats who are suddenly realizing that they're losing. One of the things I've written about here is that the biggest immigration issue that really happened, migration, was the migration of the working class from the Democratic Party in the New Deal era up to about the 70s, when to Reagan, and then the beginning where right now the working classes all vote Republican. Why do they do that? Well, the Democrats abandoned them. They decided that they would be the party of identity politics, a kind of a silo.
They can't, as neoliberals, offer working class people anything more than Republicans can. So they go with the ones that are the most entertaining and most clownish.
Yeah, and that's well put. And so I do think that this whole issue of class and economics, and given how overwhelming it is in the amygdala, in the emotional viscera of people.
Yeah.
It's so overwhelmingly important. Like, what am I going to be able to take home to feed my kids today? That the working class issues are going to rise again, and we're getting more people from the working class. Like if you take in Maine, running against Susan Collins is a guy named Graham Plattner, who is a oyster man, working class, really interesting candidate. He has a pretty troubled past, like many people, but he really, I think he's there's a lot of controversy about him, but he's really resonating to a lot of ordinary people because they've never seen politicians who are from their background, who are really working people. I don't want to romanticize him, but I think his troubles do reflect the kinds of visceral problems, emotional issues, money problems that ordinary people are having. And like I say, it's very powerful to see that the people who voted for Trump are the people in the working classes. Until I've written some of these books, I didn't realize how much of the social desert, lack of, people talk about social capital, by which they mean by social capital. Do you know this concept? It's the concept that in an existence, your capital is not only your economic capital, it's your social capital. And by that they mean the level of trusting relationships that you can count on and be secure, give you security. And it turns out when you measure social capital, when you ask people, how many people do you trust? How many people do you share a meal with? So forth, these issues I was talking about before, which are very important in my book. It turns out that it's the working classes that are the lowest in not just economic capital, but social capital. These are people who are having the double whammy of both low economic capital and really low social capital. Because one, as you pointed out, they have to work so many hours, 3 jobs. They don't have time to hang out with people. And second, they are living in what are called social deserts, areas of the city, for example, where you don't have parks or cafes or museums or libraries or other public areas where people congregate. And so Trump offered people, as I was saying, a sense of connection with each other. People got to know each other at his rallies.
Yeah.
Speaking to a social, he was building social capital in a group that was not only being economically ripped off of their own economic capital, but ripped off of their social capital. And that's where the Democratic Party has got to go. A democratic movement has got to be a movement of social capital as well as democratic economic and political capital.
Yeah, it's a real trip that all the things that we talked about today, that this sticks out the most, because the phenomenon of isolation, we've built suburbs even that keeps us isolated, and we keep we have our news and information piped into us from corporate overlords. We don't really talk to our neighbors. This was one of the reasons why I wanted to think that Europe was able to stave off whatever America's model was because when I drove across the country in the United States, I noticed the disconnect between people, their communities. But in Europe, people are more community oriented, and this could be the population density. In the Americas, we're very spread out. So it's always hard to govern when you're so geographically large. But at the same time, the isolation aspect of it, I think, is one of the biggest tools in the authoritarian tool belt to keep us scared. Because as soon as we go out and talk to somebody else, we're not as scared.
Well, we might want to have another talk also about, I did write about this theme of isolation and eating alone, and that is a very central theme of my book, Bonfire, which I did last year.
2025,
And that book is all about what I call socioside. It's exactly what we're talking about. The breaking down of social capital and relations between people, eating alone, talking to your phone rather than you're looking on social media, not connecting. My students, I got this. My students, they say their whole lives, they're 7 hours a day on social media. They don't know anybody really, they're talking to either. But both in that book and this book, I agree with you. I feel like this is the foundation. I am a sociologist, and this is the foundation of these economic and political issues. And if you're going to change those economic and political issues, you've got to build social capital. And that's what people are hungry for. Of course, they want money to be able to eat and feed their families and feed themselves, but they understand. I mean, like you say, the amygdala, all those the brain, the signals of their brain and their belly are saying, "Let me have a few hugs with a few people I care." You know. Yeah.
I think for me,
authoritarianism. Yeah.
For me, survival was always secondary in a country that lived on such excess, because I did the Jack Kerouac traveling on the skin of my own teeth. But really, what I long for more than money is because I don't have the scarcity mindset. I long for human connection, and so it's really nice to have. And this is where I get my social connection. I'm a little less lonely because of you today, Charlie. So. There you go.
It's been great to talk to you. You really are. I think you're sort of quite independent of me, wired into these really crucial connections between the emotion and personal life and the economy and political life, and that's sort of at the heart of my work too. So. It's been great to talk to you about this. Yeah.
We have a lot in common, Charlie.
We do.
Charlie Derber is a professor of sociology at Boston College, prominent social critic known for his analysis of power, democracy, and corporate rule. He is a highly prolific author, having written 30 books, with his most recent works including Fighting Oligarchy, 2026, Bonfire, 2025, Who Owns Democracy, 2024, and Dying for Capitalism, 2023. You are recognized as one of the country's most astute and eloquent social critics, praised for writing political analysis that is both persuasive and enlivened by graceful prose. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. The name of the book just out, Wired for Authoritarianism, the full title being Wired for Authoritarianism, American Oligarchies and How to Rewire America for the People. Really a pleasure to have you. Let's end the recording and let's chat right after this. What do you say?
That sounds good. Thank you very much, Chris.
Take care. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.